Herodian Book 1, Section 10. We're going to begin with the character Maternus and the narrative that follows Maternus. Section 10. Soon after this, another plot was formed against Commodus. There was a man called Maternus, an ex-soldier of notorious daring, who had deserted from the ranks and influenced others to escape service with him. Within a short time, he had collected a large band of criminals and began to make plundering raids on villages and farms. But once he had gained control of a large amount of money, he gathered together a somewhat larger number of criminals by promising them that they would be richly rewarded and have a share of the captured booty. They were now classed as enemies and no longer simply as robbers. The band proceeded to attack large cities, breaking their way into prisons and releasing the prisoners regardless of what the charges against them were. By promising them their safety, they won over supporters who were grateful for being rescued. The whole of Celtic territory in Spain were overrun. The largest cities were attacked, some were burned, and others devastated before they withdrew. When news of them reached Commodus, he flew into rage and sent threatening letters to the governors of the provinces, accusing them of negligence and giving orders for an expedition to be organized against the bandits. Maternus's men, on hearing that a force was gathering against them, abandoned the land they were plundering and quietly slipped into Italy in small groups along an unfrequented shortcut. At this stage, Maternus was beginning to have plans of a greater design, including that of capturing the empire. Because his action so far had exceeded his wildest hopes, he thought that either he must succeed in a large-scale enterprise, or at any rate, once he had become involved in the crisis, he would not die without covering himself in fame and glory. But he did not believe he had a large enough force to fight on even terms and meet Commodus in open battle, since his assessment was that the ordinary Roman people were still loyal to Commodus, and the guards also supported him. So his hope of success lay in a skillful plan, which he devised as follows. On a fixed date in the early spring of each year, the Romans celebrate a festival in honor of the Mother of the Gods. All the tokens of people's wealth and the treasures of the imperial house, things of marvelous material and workmanship, are paraded in honor of the goddess. Free license is given to all kinds of revels. Anyone can disguise himself as any character he wants. There is no position so important or exclusive that someone cannot disguise himself in that dress and play the fool by concealing his true identity, making it difficult to tell the real person from the man in fancy dress. This was the occasion Maternus thought was an ideal opportunity to get away with the plot. He hoped that if he put on the disguise of a praetorian and armed his followers in the same way, he could mingle with the crowd in guards, apparently taking a part in the procession. Then, when the people were obviously off their guard, he would rush upon Commodus and cut him down. But Maternus was betrayed by some of his men, who went ahead to Rome and revealed the plot. It was jealousy that drove them to it. The prospect of having an emperor in place of a robber chief. Before the day of the festival, Maternus was arrested and beheaded while his fellow conspirators received the punishment they deserved. Commodus sacrificed to the goddess and conceded a public thanksgiving before completing the festival and joining in their rejoicing and procession of the goddess. During the festival, the people had a public celebration for the safety of the emperor. Section 11. Through my research, I have discovered why the Romans have an especial veneration for this goddess. And in view of the lack of knowledge about this among the Greeks, I have decided to record it at this point. The story is that the actual statue of the goddess fell from Zeus, but no one knows what it is made of or who crafted the statue, and they say it is not a human workmanship at all. The account says that the statue fell from the sky a long time ago and was first found in a palace in Phrygia. The name of the palace is Pessinus, which gets its name from the fall of statue. It gets its name from the fall of the statue out of the sky. Other accounts have a story about a battle that took place there between Ilus and Phrygian and Tantalus the Lydian. Though some sources say it was over rites of passage, others that it was over the rape of Ganymede. A long battle was fought in which both sides were evenly matched, and since quite a number of men fell on either side, the name of the place was taken from the disaster. The tale is that after he had been seized, Ganymede disappeared at this spot, torn to pieces between his lover and his brother. After the disappearance of his mortal remains, the sufferings of the young man were venerated in a legend which said he had been snatched away by Zeus. At this same place, Pessinus, the Phrygians used to practice their orgiastic rites on the banks of the river Gallus, from which the eunuchs dedicated to the service of the goddess, and they get their name. When the Roman state was growing powerful, it is said that an oracle announced to the Romans that their empire would endure and grow still greater if they brought the goddess of Pessinus to Rome. Whereupon they sent an embassy to the Phrygians asking for the statue. They gained their request without difficulty by citing their kinship with the Phrygians and outlining how they were the descendants of Aeneas the Phrygian. When the statue had been transported by ship and had reached the mouth of the river Tiber, which the Romans used to use as their harbor, some supernatural force made the vessel run aground. The Roman people turned out in force and spent a long time trying to tow the ship off, but it was held fast by the sandbar and refused to sail upstream. Finally, they brought to the scene the priestess of the goddess, that is the goddess Vesta, who was under a vow of chastity, but was being charged with adultery. Since judgment was upon the point of being passed on her, the priestess begged the people to allow the goddess of Pessinus to give the verdict. She took off her sash and threw it on the prow of the ship with the prayer that if she were still an innocent virgin, the ship would respond to her. When the ship, with the sash tied to it, followed her without hindrance, the Romans were full of awe at this manifestation of the goddess and the holiness of the maiden. This story about the goddess of Pessinus may be rather glamorous, but it contains quite interesting information for people who are unfamiliar with Roman history. After his escape from Maternus's plot, Commodus surrounded himself with a stronger guard and rarely appeared in public anymore, spending most of his time avoiding legal and imperial business away in the suburban districts or on his imperial estates far away from Rome. Section 12. Just at this time, a plague struck Italy, but it was most severe in Rome, which, apart from being normally overcrowded, that is, was still getting immigrants from all over the world. The result was a tremendous toil of life among men and beasts of burden. On the advice of his doctors, Commodus retired for the time to Laurentum, a cooler spot, shaded by the huge laurel groves, which the place gives its name to. The doctors thought this place was safe because it was reputed to be immune from infectious diseases in the atmosphere by virtue of the redolent fragrance of the laurels and the pleasant shade of the trees. The inhabitants of the city followed the doctor's orders too by filling their nostrils and ears with sweet scented perfume and making constant use of incense and aromatic herbs. Some said that if the sweet-smelling scent filled the sensory passages first, it stopped them inhaling the polluted air. If an infection were to get in, they said, the scent drove it out by its greater potency. In spite of this, the plague was rampant, causing enormous loss of life among men and all the animals that came into contact with men. At the same time, there was a famine in the city, which was due to the man called Cleander, a Phrygian by birth, who was one of those normally sold by public auction. He became a slave of the imperial household, and as Commodus gained power, he did also. Until he finally was raised by the emperor to such a position of honor and power that he had control of the bodyguard, was appointed chamberlain, and was put in command of the soldiers. His greed and insolence led him to covet even the position of emperor. He amassed a large sum of money and he bought up most all the corn supply, but then cut off its distribution, the idea being that if he first caused a shortage of supplies and then won people over by generous distributions, when they were desperately in need, he would gradually gain the loyalty of the people and the soldiers. He also built a huge gymnasium, which he made over as a public bath, to the people, trying in this way to entice them to support him. But the Romans hated him because they held him responsible for their troubles and loathed his never-ending greed for money. First, they organized themselves in the theaters and shouted insults at him altogether. But finally, they went in a mass to where Commodus was living on the outskirts of the city and set up a shout demanding Cleander's blood. While this riot was taking place all around the area, Commodus was spending his time enjoying himself in the secluded quarters of his palace without any idea of the commotion going on, because Cleander prevented the news reaching him. Then suddenly, without any warning to the people, the whole imperial cavalry appeared on the scene, fully armed at Cleander's orders, charging and cutting down anyone they came across. The mob, without weapons and on foot, could not stand up to the armed horsemen. They turned and ran for the city. Some were just cut down by the swords of the soldiers and trampled underfoot by the horses. But many died in the crush of the crowd, and the horsemen as they stumbled on top of each other. The cavalry were unchecked in their pursuit right up to the city gates, slaughtering those who fell without mercy. But when the people that had stayed behind the city saw the horror of what had happened, they locked the doors of the houses and climbed onto the rooftops. From there, they pelted the horsemen with stones and tiles. The horsemen began to get a spell of their own treatment because there was no one to fight with at close quarters, and the mob was hurling things at them from a safe distance. Unable to stand the heavy casualties, they retreated, leaving many of their number dead. Under the steady hail of stones, the horses stepped on the rolling pebbles and slipped, throwing off their riders. A large number were killed on either side before the urban cohorts, who hated the cavalry, came to the rescue of the people. And that is the end of section 12. And let me look 13. Is short enough to include in this stream as well. With the events, some stars shown casually. Okay, I think 13. Short person. I think we're going to keep going with 13 and maybe stop at 13 with the new stream. So here we go, 13. Even though there was a civil war raging, the fear of Cleander's power was such that no one was prepared to tell Commodus what was going on. In the end, Commodus's eldest sister, Fadila, who had free access to him as a sister, ran into the emperor with her hair all disheveled and threw herself down on the ground, looking exactly like someone in mourning. "My lord," she cried, "here you are, blissfully unaware of what's going on, while you are in deadly peril. But we, your own family, are going to be destroyed. The Roman people and most of the soldiers have deserted you. Our own people are doing the sort of thing we never expected to happen to us at the hands of any barbarian. Your past favorites are now your enemies. Cleander has organized the soldiers and the people against you. Because of mutual hostility and antagonism, his bitter enemies, the people, and his warm supporters, the entire cavalry hosts, are up in arms and involving the city in a civil war by destroying each other. If you do not immediately put to death this wicked servant of yours, who has already caused so much disaster to some people and will almost certainly bring it down upon us too, then both sides will be the ruin of us." When she had finished, she tore her clothes. Some of the attendants, who were encouraged to speak up when they heard the emperor's sister talk, unnerved Commodus completely. He was absolutely terrified at the urgency of the danger which threatened, not sometime in the future, but then and there. Cleander knew nothing about Fatilla's denunciations, though he had his suspicions, was summoned, and on arrival was ordered to be arrested and executed. Then his head was struck on the end of a long spear and sent out to the people who had longed to see this welcome sight. So the trouble came to an end and both sides stopped fighting. The soldiers, now they saw the people for whom they were fighting were dead, were frightened of the emperor's anger, since they realized that they had been misled into foolhardily actions which he viewed with displeasure. The people had had enough once they had taken their revenge on the man responsible for their troubles. The two sons of Cleander were put to death, as well as anyone who had known to be a friend of his. Their bodies were dragged through the city and shamefully degraded in every way until finally the mutilated corpses were thrown into the sewers. Such was the end of Cleander and his supporters. One might say that nature is anxious to demonstrate in the person of one man that some trivial, unsuspected quirk of fortune can raise someone from the meanest depths to the loftiest heights and then cast him down again. Commodus now feared there would be popular violence and an attempt to remove him by revolution. Nevertheless, on the advance of his friends, he returned to the city, where he was welcomed with great honors by the people and was escorted to procession back to the palace. But after the experience of such a crisis, his general suspicions led him to strike mercilessly and give a ready hearing to any accusation without admitting credible witnesses to his presence. He cut himself off from his interest in moral studies and continually gave his whole mind to the slavish pursuit of unrestrained physical pleasure day and night. Any person of moderation or anyone who even mildly reminded him still of what he had been taught was driven from the court on the charge of conspiracy, while clowns and performers of scurrilous acts gained complete control over him. He began to train to be a charioteer and to take part in combat with wild animals, practices which his flatterers praised as though giving him a reputation for courage. But his participation was less than proper for an expirer of modesty. And that is the end of section 13. And we will begin the next time with section 14 of Herodian Book 1. Thank you.